we see the black king in the center. A white rook sits next to the black king where it could be captured. What should we do? If we play queen to g5, the queen protects the white rook. The white rook controls e4. We'll make that red. And d4. The queen controls f5, e5, and d5. So the queen has a barrier on the 5th rank. The rook has a barrier on the 4th rank, and both queen and rook control f6. That leaves black 2 squares, e6 and d6, both of which are closer to the edge of the board than where he sits now. The king moves to e6, and now white continues the plan. Because the rook controls the F file, we could slide the queen over to control the E file, but perhaps you can see that the rook on F4 cannot protect the queen on D5, and that the black king can take the queen. So that plan does not work. Instead, we move the rook up to f6. The rook is protected by the queen. The rook maintains control of the critical squares on the F file. The queen maintains controls of the 5th rank. The rook gains control of the 6th rank, and the black king must move to e7 or d7. King moves to e7, and now what do we do? We could drive the king to the A file by moving the queen. Then the rook moves, then the rook, and so on. But why not drive him to the 8th rank, since he's only 1 square from there, as it is. Queen to g7, puts the king in check, gains control of the 7th rank. The rook and queen control f8. The rook has the 6th rank under control, and the rook on f6 is protected by the queen. Now the black king must move to e8 or d8. It matters not which square black moves to. We'll move to e8, and we can see that rook to f8 puts the king in check, controls the rest of the 8th rank. The rook is protected by the queen, and the queen controls the 7th rank. Checkmate. Let's watch this again. Queen to g5 check, king to e6, rook to f6 check, king to e7, queen to g7 check, king to e8, and rook to f8 checkmate. Now this position. Again, a rook is in danger, but as we saw before, we don't have to move a piece that's under attack if we can protect that piece. Queen to c4 protects the rook, gains control of the 4th rank. The rook controls the 5th rank. The queen and rook control d3. The black king must move to e3 or f3. Rook king moves to e3, and now rook to d3 checks the king, controlling the 3rd rank. the queen maintains control of the fourth rank. The queen and rook control, I'm sorry, just the rook controls d2. The queen protects the rook on d3. The black king has two squares from which it must choose. King moves to e2, and now we roll the barrier down the board toward the first rank. Queen to c2 gains control of the second rank. The rook maintains control of the third rank and is still protected by the queen. d1 is now controlled by the queen, and the black king must move to e1 or f1. King e1, and now rook to d1 is checkmate. In this position, the white king has joined the game. Here, the white king has a row of 3 squares that the black king would not be able to enter if it were on the fourth rank. We're going to see how this plays a role. The queen controls the sixth rank, and a diagonal, e5 and d4, next to the black king. The rook controls the e file, which includes 2 squares controlled by the queen and 1 controlled only by the rook. That leaves the black king 2 squares to move to. We move the rook to e5, and now we still have the sixth rank controlled by the queen. We've taken complete control of the fifth rank by the rook, which is protected by the queen. The rook still controls e4. The queen has lost control of d4 because the rook now blocks the queen, and the king has c4 and d4 to which it may move. King moves to d4. And what should white play next? If we try d6, we leave the black king the c4 square. The white king controls c3 and d3. The white rook controls e4 and e3. The rook and queen control d5 and c5, and the black king must move to c4. If, however, from this position we move the queen down, we now have these 2 squares controlled by the king. The white king and black king are both not permitted next to each other, so these 2 squares are a no man's land. Black king may not move to d3 or c3 because of the white king. The rook controls the e file, which includes, in this case, e4 and e3, which are also controlled by the queen. The queen controls the fourth rank, e4, d4, and c4. The rook controls the fifth rank, c5, d5, and the rook is protected by the white queen. Black is in check and has no square that it may move to. It is checkmate.